Well, good morning. Welcome to Andy Lewis, who's the Deputy Chief Inspector of the Rail Accident Investigation Branch. And thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate it. It's making me feel very old, is this, because I was reporting on the railway right through the back half of the 1990s when I was first appointed on rail, which, of course, when RAIB was born from the Cullen Inquiry. So I was very familiar with the landscape before RAIB and for when Carolyn Griffiths was first appointed. In fact, I read yesterday, and this made me feel ancient, an interview I did with Carolyn in the summer of 2004, I think. Just before we start, maybe we'll put some links on our website of sort of connections to your own website and various leaflets, and I noticed a PDF leaflet describing what RAIB was all about yesterday. But just in a few sentences, just give us your interpretation as what you see as RAIB's job and where it's come from, what it's for, what it does, and how it does it.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here. RAIB, as you say, was born out of the Cullen Inquiry into the Ladbroke Grove train crash, and our job is about safety learning. It's about learning from accidents and incidents, looking for the causes and making recommendations so that they don't occur again, or reduce the likelihood of them occurring again. You can go all the way back really to the Railway Inspectorate, and obviously most of us will be familiar with Red for Danger from Tom Rolt.
Oh, yes.
And the story about how the Victorians looked at accidents, investigated the causes of some terrible accidents such as the Aviemore accident, and came up with the fundamentals of the railway safety today, which is lock, block and brake, still the principles of it. So that's our job. It's to look at accidents, to look at incidents, find the cause and make recommendations so that they don't happen again. So RAIB is a no-blame investigator. Mm-hmm. And that's a concept that came out, again, it's one with a long history. The first Inspector of Accidents was Captain Coburn, who was the Inspector of Accidents for the Royal Flying Corps. And that became the Accidents Branch, which is now our sister branch, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. And the idea of having a no-blame investigation, and that varies slightly perhaps from what the Victorians would have seen, was to create a safe space for people to talk and to help us get to the bottom of the cause of accidents, so people can talk without worrying about the consequences for themselves and for their companies. Now, I'm fairly sure that the Edwardians in the First World War wouldn't have used the term safe space. No. But that's essentially what we're doing, is we're creating an area where people can be free and frank with us, give us information and help us to find these safety lessons.
Okay. As I say, I mean, excuse me, I sat through long sections of the Cullen Inquiry and saw it all at first hand. And it was no surprise to me that the Noble Lord wanted to replace the A in AAIB with R for RAIB. There was a real appetite for the police to be kept behind the tapes, maintain the perimeter, and you guys to take just primacy like the AAIB do and be completely in charge and simplify the whole thing. That's not happened, has it?
So there's a legal framework which dictates how we work with other agencies, and they have their job to do. As you say, it may be the police, the British Transport Police, it may be the regulator, ORR, and obviously there are other regulators we work with, for example, in Northern Ireland. So there's a legal framework which dictates how we will work together, and when you're dealing with the site of an accident, that basically expects us to work together, to allow each other access to site, to allow each other access to factual evidence. And I'll come on to some of the evidence we can't share perhaps later. So there's a legal framework, and then there's an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which is essentially a written agreement between the organisations as to how we will work together. And that's something we practice quite regularly on training exercises. So we did some in Derbyshire last year to make sure that we all understand what the requirements are. But what the law says essentially, and what the MOU acknowledges, is there's a requirement for coordination, there's a requirement for communication, and it's important that we work together, but that the safety investigation does get primacy if this is an accident. And that reflects the fact that obviously safety is a priority, the safety of the public. Now, I said there's some evidence we can't share, so we will share, for example, photograph survey results, OTDR downloads and things, factual evidence. And that's important because you don't want organisations competing for information. That's not helpful for anybody and not for the public. But we, for example, can interview witnesses and in conditions of strict confidentiality. We can't disclose witness identities. or their direct testimony without a court order. So there is cooperation and coordination, but also we do have this ability to talk to people in confidence, and that goes back to this no blame thing and the idea of learning safety lessons.
Because that isn't what Cullen kind of intended, was it? I mean, I read my interview with Carolyn yesterday, and she made the point, this is not my interpretation, that Axe investigation needed a significant step change away from the previous overlap and confusion. And what she said was, and this is a direct quote, it cannot be an organic thing. People need to realise this is different, and that is what the new organisation is going to do. I mean, but we didn't see that step change, did we? Otherwise, you wouldn't have the need for memoranda of understanding and all the coordination that you talked. The idea of RAIB having primacy and a lot of simplification just never occurred.
I don't think there is confusion. I think that each organisation's roles are clear on site. We understand each other well. We work together, and as I say, we exercise these processes that encourage us to work together, and it's a legal framework. But and Carolyn was my first chief inspector, so I wouldn't want to contradict her.
I wouldn't dare.
I wouldn't dare. In fact, you're quite right. But I think we have made a step change. I think we do provide something different. We've been operational for 20 years. In that time, we've made, I think, about 1,900 safety recommendations. Now, obviously, we're part of an industry effort towards safety, and that gives us the railway we have today, which is safe. And obviously, unfortunately, there still are accidents, but we've made great progress. And I would say that we have made that step change. RAIB is accepted in the industry. I think our recommendations do make a difference. I think our reports are accepted as what they are, which is independent. Our independence is in law, and the Chief Inspector reports directly to the Secretary of State. So we have independence. We can make the recommendations we think are suitable. We can investigate the accidents we think we need to investigate. So yes, I would say that we do have that.
And you have got primacy on site with regard to evidence. I mean, I remember at Southall, as doubtless you will, the BTP of a different era was actually ploughing wrecked AWS equipment into the ballast because it didn't know what it was looking at as it cleared up the crash. That's just not going to happen these days, isn't it? I mean, the AAIB would never be ploughing black boxes into the remains of a runway, would it?
No. And of course, as I say, we do practice this procedure. So we work with BTP, we work with ORR. We are independent, but we don't work in isolation. So we are careful to practice these processes. We all understand each other's role. And as I say, when we get to site, although we're independent and there's some stuff we can't share, we do work together. We do generate a common evidence collection plan, because ultimately there's one railway, there's one set of vehicles, there's one set of OTDR data. And as I say, it's not helpful for anybody to have people competing. So we work well together while maintaining our independence. And I think the process generally is very successful.
Jolly good. Okay. Can we look at a few specifics? And
Sure.
I have actually been in the position once when I was a director of the Great Centre. I had to call Caroline on a Saturday morning to trigger an RAIB investigation after a bit of a mishap. And while it was very straightforward, basically, an engine driver forgot where he was, ran into the back of a set of carriages. I was surprised at how long it took to produce that report. Why does it take so long? You probably get fed up with being asked that, no, and I do apologise.
No, not at all. So, as you're probably aware, but your viewers and listeners might not be, there's a statutory framework, and that suggests that we normally report within 12 months. The normally reflects the fact that some investigations will inevitably take longer than 12 months if they're major accidents, if they're very technically complex accidents. So, for example, at the end of 2023, we published a report into the London Gateway derailment, which was a freight derailment, a container wagon derailment. That took almost 2 years, but that reflected the fact that that investigation needed us to instrument a freight wagon and to take measurements down the brake pipe and do a lot of modelling.
Okay.
So in some cases there are complexities. And in fact, you might be interested in one of the conclusions of the report was that the cause of the accident was longitudinal dynamics up and down the train. And there wasn't good knowledge in the industry of this. and there were gaps in regulation and well, rather standards rather than regulation and assessment tools for designers. Yet when you looked at the manual for British Rail derailment investigation from the 1980s, it was in there because it was actually a factor that was well known to the railway historically, but had faded from knowledge because of the different way that freight trains operated.
Really?
But now has come
How
back.
interesting.
So it's not just about learning safety lessons. It's about retaining safety lessons. Anyway, to go back to length of investigation, so there are some that will take more, and it's important, obviously, that investigations are right.
And you've got to get it right, I accept that.
Yeah, we've got to get it right. But we are aware that we have not been meeting that 12-month target, and there are a number of reasons for that. In essence, the measurement does in some ways go back 2 years and reflects the condition of the branch over a longer period and some of the external pressures we've had. Now, we've put a lot of work in on the last 2 years looking at these, and I think this year we're going to be under 12 months. And we're not complacent about that. We understand there's still room to improve. And in fact, I have a workshop next month with some of our managers and some of our staff to look at how we can be even quicker.
Look, can we just look at one or two bits and pieces of current investigations, which I hope don't come across as carping at bits and pieces, but I'm genuinely curious.
Sure.
Strathspey and the Flying Scotsman thing.
Yes.
And look, cards on the table. I come at this from the point of view of an experienced steam footplateman who was first passed to drive in 1984 on the Lakeside Railway, and then drove on the Great Central, our only double track heritage railway, for 15 years, which was very different and very demanding. So I do know a bit about what I'm talking about, I think. And that report surprised me a bit in how easygoing it came across, shall we say. I mean, for example, my view is the driver needs to be acutely aware at all times of his position and intention when shunting. And the very idea of saying, well, the carriages are never there, they're always somewhere else, I would expect to get my backside roundly kicked if I offered that as a genuine reason for running into a set of carriages. But it seemed to pass with not much comment in that report. It was, well, the carriages weren't in the same place, and it seemed to be accepted.
So obviously our role is to learn safety lessons from an accident, to look at what happened on the day and try and prevent it from happening again. So if you look at the Aviemore accident, there's a number of things going on. So it's an operation they've done before, but there are key differences this time. As you say, the carriages are in a different position. There's some ambiguity of roles, again, because there's other things going on. There are other people present who are not normally present during this move, and there's a confusion about who's keeping a lookout. And we're quite clear about the railway's rules in that respect, that they expected the driver to keep a lookout or to arrange for a lookout to be kept. But if you just stop there and say, well, the driver should have known, you don't really ask yourself the question, why didn't they know? And our job really is to get to these causes. I mean, imagine an RAIB investigation is essentially, the way I'd explain it, or it's been explained to me, is we've all been taught the fire triangle at school. And I'm sure my fellow engineers at home are going, actually, it's a tetrahedron, but we'll go with a triangle. And you've got oxygen and fuel, and you've got a source of heat or ignition. But if you take one away, the fire triangle collapses. And accidents are a bit like that. They're interlocking cause. It's very rarely just one thing. And in some cases, you're trying to take away, for example, error. It's not always error by people. Sometimes equipment fails. But if we talk about error, sometimes you might be able to take away the error, sort of the heat source, the ignition source, or reduce the opportunity. And that's what we're trying to do in RAIB. So in this case, we're looking at why a driver might not have known the coaches were there, because that helps us with the next accident. And in this case, there wasn't planning or briefing. People hadn't really talked about the operation in advance. People didn't really understand what everybody was doing, and they didn't have the situational awareness of where the coaches were. And that's actually what created the conditions for the accident.
But is that not the driver's job? And I would have just expected a bit more sternness of tone, I guess. Likewise, the idea that there were 6 on the footplate, I would not have put up with that. The conclusion that actually did bother me was when you said there was no evidence of distraction. To me, 6 on the footplate is in itself a huge distraction.
Right, but I think it's important to say that our reports have to be based on evidence. We're asking people to accept our reports as thorough and professional, and actually to implement the recommendations. And I might go to somebody and say, in my opinion, this might have been a distraction, and they might agree with me and they might implement the recommendation. But it's better, actually, if I can go to them and say, I've got evidence, either witness evidence or data evidence as to what was going on here. And in this case, there was no evidence. The number of people was the distraction. What was the problem was that nobody was clear about what everybody was doing. And that's what the evidence told us. And that leads us to our safety lessons, which is really down to how the railway planned this visit and thought about what they were doing. And they've introduced a new process around that, because there were some key changes and some changes in risk, which if you set back and planned this and briefed, you may not have had the accident. The driver may have known where the coaches were. They may have been less likely to make an error, or they may have introduced extra measures. Some of your viewers suggested putting an extra person on track, for example, with a radio, which might have been a measure that the railway itself had come up with.
A shunter on the ground. Yeah. It's a matter of tone, I think, Andy. I was just surprised not to see a sterner tone, because to me, 6 in a cab is a distraction, full stop. 6 bodies dotted around in a small engine cab are a real distraction in itself. But your report said there's no evidence of a distraction.
Well, no, what we said was there's ambiguity in role because of where people were sat and the position they had. And we did make a learning point, though. We didn't make a recommendation, but we made a learning point, which is an important safety message to staff, saying you should observe the numbers in your cab because potentially on another occasion they might be a distraction. And we also made a learning point about the importance of keeping an effective lookout or making sure that you're clear who is keeping the lookout.
Well, was it breached their own rules, wasn't it?
Well, we wouldn't
6 in the cab.
Yeah, so we have actually said what the rule was, and we've said what the driver did on this occasion. And as I say, we've made the learning points.
All right. So I'm not picking holes. I was in the strange situation of an engineman saying you should have been harder on the engineman, but there you go. Talerddig. Can we have a quick look at that? However we pronounce it before the pronunciation unit of green signals leaps upon me. Is there anything you can update us there, particularly with regard to those blocked auto sanders on the westbound DMU? In circumstances like that, do you if in aviation incidents, either the NTSB in the States or whatever will send out a bulletin if there's a particular issue saying you need to look at this landing gear or that transponder or whatever? Do you send out a bulletin right round every operator in the country saying, make sure your sanders are clear?
Yeah, so obviously the investigation's ongoing and I can't comment further other than what we've put on our website. But to address your question about how we talk to the industry about what we've found, there's liaison with the other agencies involved. There's liaison with the safety teams at the operator and the infrastructure manager as well. We can release some information. There are some restrictions on that. We have to make sure it won't interfere with our investigation, but we can share information. And that could include sort of test results and things like that. And quite often we want the industry to be involved in the testing. Obviously, it's important that we stay independent. They've often got useful technical skills and useful knowledge of the equipment. So there is somewhat of a collaborative approach in some ways. Now, in terms of what we do if we find something before we issue a report, we can issue urgent safety advice. I recently have issued urgent safety advice as an example on our website. There's one at Audenshaw, which was a derailment near Manchester last September on a timber bridge, a longitudinal timber bridge. And that was talking about the fact the chair screws, which I'm sure you know, hold the base plate onto the timber via packing. They'd failed in fatigue, metal fatigue essentially, but it wasn't an apparent failure. The screws could still look like they were whole and in place and effective. So that's an example of an issue where we said, okay, the investigation isn't finished, but from the metallurgy that we've done so far, the analysis we've done so far, we can see there's a potential hidden failure, and we'd seen it before at the Sheffield derailment we investigated. So we can do that. And in the case of big investigations, we can also issue an interim report if we feel it's appropriate. So for Salisbury, for example,
I've seen that. Salisbury was one.
We issued an interim report because we're very conscious, of course, that the industry will need to have some information for next year's autumn preparedness, which will start in the spring. And that's where the companies will look at the risks involved and their processes for next autumn season. So there are mechanisms for us to do that.
Okay, and what about, is there any resolution to that question which was unresolved about whether both trains were still moving? There was some question as to whether the eastbound train was stood or still rolling at the time of the impact.
Yeah, so what we've said in the last information we released is the eastbound train was doing approximately 6 miles an hour and the westbound train was between 15 and 24. Now, I can't elaborate too much on this particular accident, but I don't know if it'd be helpful if I explain generally how we get that sort of data.
Okay.
So if you can imagine that trains have black boxes on train data recorders, and they give us a lot of very useful information, but they're quite recent actually. If you go back to the 90s, we mentioned, if you look at Cannon Street, for example, which was a buffer stop collision in which several people were sadly killed, there's a lot of discussion about train speed, talking to witnesses about what they thought and what they saw, because there was no source. The recorders were being fitted but hadn't reached all trains. So for us, this is about 20 to 25-year-old technology for all trains, but very useful. But the train uses a rotating wheel, and it gets a pulse off that, and it can work out from that, because it knows the wheel diameter, it can work out distances and speeds. And often that's a very easy process to download those if the train is live. If the train isn't live for some reason, it's not got power to it, we have to take the recorder off and download it. But again, we have good processes for that. We have a specialist team, the electronic data team at RAIB, who look after that. But to some degree, you have to also make sure what you're looking at in terms of information. So if you've had derailed running or running with significant wheel slide and wheel slip, or if there's been any interference on the wheel rail interface, you sometimes have to do a bit more work to get accurate results. So you need to cross-reference into other systems such as CCTV. You might need to look at systems that have GPS on, which many maintenance systems do. So just to explain that, in many cases, we will give an approximate speed or a banded speed because we're still working on that cross-referencing and narrowing things down.
Broughty Ferry, just briefly before we go, sure. Anything new on that? Because there was a warning in advance which just failed to get through. So I'm sure you'll have some views on the processes for passing emergency bulletins to drivers.
Yeah, so actually the report was issued just before Christmas. And in that, we do pick up the issue that a member of the public, 12 minutes before the collision, had seen the tree fall. They'd phoned Network Rail's helpline, but the helpline then could not get through to route control. And our assessment, as we say in the report, is that the first call that was made from the helpline would probably have been made in time to prevent the accident from occurring, and possibly also the second call. Now, what we say in our report is, as a result of this accident, and this goes back to really safety learning from accidents and incidents, Network Rail has changed its process. The helpline now has a priority line to control centres, and the control centres themselves have expanded the pool of staff that can answer them. So hopefully, in future, when a priority call is made, it will be picked up.
Jolly good. Thanks ever so much for joining us. It's always fascinating. I'm always very impressed by we'd like to see the investigations done quicker and faster and the resolutions more prompt, but I am always hugely impressed with the measured and thorough approach. So well done on that. You all do a great job in often trying circumstances, particularly after a mishap when the mood's a bit febrile, and particularly the wider media are getting a bit excited. So more power to your elbow. And Andy Lewis, Deputy Chief Inspector at the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, thank you for joining us. And I hope we meet at the line side at some point for a chat or a thermos of coffee or something.
Thanks very much, Nigel. I look forward to catching up with you then.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.